I opened the door expecting the wind. It was nearly midnight in Asheville, North Carolina, and the wind was the only thing that ever knocked that late, that hard, that insistent. Instead, I found Maya standing on my porch under the yellow bulb by my door, a lantern hanging dark and unlit from her hand. Its cord wound twice around her wrist like she hadn't quite decided, on the drive over, whether she was going to let go of it or turn around and take it home. "You haven't come for a while," she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. So, I came instead. I didn't ask what she meant. Not yet. I just stood there in the doorway, the cold air moving past me into the house, and I understood, somewhere underneath the confusion, that this had nothing to do with Sunday dinner and everything to do with 3 months of silence. I'd told myself I was handling just fine. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 36 years old, and I fix things people have given up on. Chairs with broken spines, cabinets nobody wants to save, tables that have been sitting in somebody's garage for 10 years because throwing them away felt worse than looking at them every day. I have a small shop on the edge of Asheville, sawdust in every corner, a radio that only picks up 2 stations, and a workbench I've had since I was 24 years old. I live alone. I've never been married. No kids. Just me, a set of hand tools passed down from my grandfather, and a habit of believing that just because something is broken doesn't mean it's finished. I used to be in a relationship with a woman named Elena Whitfield. We were together almost 3 years, and when it ended the way most honest things end quietly, without a villain anywhere in the room. Nobody cheated. Nobody raised their voice. We simply wanted different rooms in the same house we were never going to build together. She wanted the noise of a bigger life, the kind that moves fast and doesn't apologize for it. I wanted a workshop that smelled like walnut and a Sunday that felt the same as the one before it. We loved each other enough to know that loving each other wasn't going to be enough on its own, and we said goodbye to each other in a parking lot on an ordinary Tuesday. And that, as far as either of us was concerned, was supposed to be the end of it. What surprised me wasn't the breakup itself. It was everything that came after. Elena's grandmother, a woman named Ruth Whitfield, had never let go of me, not for a single Sunday. Ruth was 78 years old that year, sharp as a tack, and she ran her house the exact same way she ran her opinions, with absolute confidence and very little patience for nonsense of any kind. On the very first Sunday after Elena and I split, my phone rang, and it was Ruth. "You're still coming for dinner," she said. It wasn't phrased as a question, and I understood immediately that it wasn't meant to be answered as one either. So I did. For 17 months, every single Sunday, without missing one, I drove out past the tree line to that old house with the wraparound porch and the amber lantern hanging beside the front door, and I sat at Ruth's table like I'd always belonged there. And across from me, every single time, sat Elena's younger sister, Maya. Maya was 31 years old that year, a NICU nurse at the hospital downtown, the kind of person who spent her working hours holding babies who weighed less than a bag of flour, and somehow still had enough gentleness left over for the rest of us by the time evening came around. She was quiet in a way that made people lean in instead of look away, the kind of quiet that felt full rather than empty. She didn't fill silences just for the sake of filling them, and every single Sunday, before I'd even taken my coat off, there was already a place set for me at that table, the good fork, the chair away from the draft by the window, no onions anywhere near my plate, because she remembered, without my ever having to remind her even once, that I couldn't stand the taste of them. I told myself for a long time that it was just family kindness, the kind of thing you extend without thinking to somebody who used to date your sister and somehow, against all logic, became your grandmother's favorite person regardless. I didn't let myself examine it any harder than that. Not at first. It was easier not to. There was a version of my life that made sense if I kept things simple. Sunday dinner. An old woman who liked my company, as a sister-in-law who wasn't technically my sister-in-law anymore, all of it filed neatly under the heading of family. Nothing more complicated than that. I had no idea, back then, that underneath all that quiet kindness was something Maya had been carrying for a very long time. Something she was far better at hiding than I ever gave her credit for. I was about to spend the next several months of my life learning exactly how much a person can say to you without ever once saying it out loud. The 17 months after Elena and I split were, if I'm honest with myself, some of the steadiest months of my life. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from routine, from knowing exactly where you'll be and who you'll be sitting across from on any given evening, and Sunday dinner at Ruth's became the center of mine. I'd finish up whatever I was restoring in the shop, a rocking chair with a cracked spindle, a hope chest somebody's grandmother had left them, once an entire dining set that had survived a house fire and somehow still had good bones underneath the soot, and I'd drive out past the tree line just as the light went gold over the hills, and I'd see that lantern glowing amber on the porch before I ever saw the house itself. That light, more than anything, meant I was almost there. Ruth liked to sit at the head of the table and ask questions that were really just her opinions wearing a disguise. "You still haven't sold that cherry wood dresser, have you?" she'd say, not waiting for an answer. Already certain she was right, and she usually was. Maya would pour the tea before anyone asked for it, always a little extra in my cup, and always one more full cup poured than the table actually needed. "In case somebody shows up thirsty," she'd say, with a small shrug, though nobody ever did show up thirsty except me, and we both knew it, and neither of us ever said so out loud. After dinner, once Ruth had gone up to bed with her usual complaint about her knees and her usual insistence that she didn't need any help on the stairs, Maya and I would end up out on the porch, just the two of us, under that lantern, talking about nothing that mattered and everything that did. She'd tell me about a baby in the NICU who'd finally crossed 5 pounds, the tiny milestone that made her whole week worth it. I'd tell her about a chair leg that refused to sit flush no matter how many times I sanded it down. We'd sit out there long after the conversation had any real reason to continue, the night getting colder around us, and neither of us ever seemed to be in much of a hurry to be the one who ended it. "Why do you keep coming, Nathan?" she asked me once, maybe 8 or 9 months into all of it. "Really, Ruth's not going anywhere. You don't owe this family a single Sunday, because your grandmother makes the best apple pie in Buncombe County," I said, and she laughed, but it didn't quite reach her eyes the way her laugh usually did. I noticed that. I filed it away somewhere I didn't look at very often, the same place I kept a lot of things about Maya that I wasn't ready to examine too closely. There was a night, somewhere around month 12, when the lantern's wiring started acting up, flickering hard every time the wind picked up off the ridge. I climbed up on the porch rail to fix the connection, and Maya held the ladder steady below me, one hand resting near my ankle for balance. When I finally climbed back down, my sleeve brushed against wet paint on the railing. Ruth had been touching up the trim that week, insisting she could still handle a paintbrush just fine, and Maya grabbed my arm quickly to stop me before I smeared it across my shirt. Her hand stayed there half a second longer than it strictly needed to. I noticed that too. I said nothing, and neither did she, and we went back to our chairs like it hadn't happened at all, though I thought about it the whole drive home. Around month 15, something in Elena's voice started to change whenever she called to check in on Ruth. She'd lost her job that spring. The marketing firm downtown had gone through a round of layoffs, and Elena, despite being genuinely good at what she did, had been part of the cut. She didn't talk about it much on those calls, but I could hear it underneath everything else she said, a kind of carefulness in her voice that hadn't been there before, like she was walking across ice and trying not to let anyone hear her testing each step. And that was around the same time she started mentioning a name none of us had heard before. "Derek," she said one Sunday over speakerphone, while Ruth was busy in the kitchen. "He's a realtor. He's been really good to me lately, Ruth. You'd like him." I didn't think much of it at the time. People find people when they need them, especially when the ground under their own feet has gone unsteady. I was happy for her, in the uncomplicated way you're happy for someone you used to love but no longer ache for, the way you're happy for an old friend whose life is moving forward in a direction that has nothing to do with you anymore. It was maybe 2 months after that, around month 17, that I actually met him. It was a regular Sunday, nothing special about it at first, and Elena stopped by Ruth's house to pick something up on her way to somewhere else. Derek came with her, waited by the car at first, then finally walked up onto the porch when Elena took longer inside than he must have expected. I remember shaking his hand, a firm grip, a practiced smile, the kind of confidence that fills up a room before the person standing in it has actually said anything worth listening to yet. He didn't say much to me that evening, just a few pleasantries. The weather, something about property values rising on the east side of town, delivered the way some people deliver small talk, as a kind of performance rather than a conversation. But I remember the way his eyes moved across the porch just before he left. Landing on the two rocking chairs Maya and I always left angled toward each other, instead of toward the yard, the way we always sat when the night ran long and neither of us wanted to leave. He looked at those two empty chairs a beat longer than made any real sense for a man who had never even sat in either of them. Then he smiled, said something polite about needing to get going, and led Elena back down to the car. I didn't think about it again that night. I had no particular reason to. Ruth made her comment about the cherry wood dresser. Maya poured one extra cup of tea nobody had asked for, and the evening ended the same unremarkable way most of our evenings ended. But looking back on it now, with everything I understand today that I didn't understand then, I think that was the exact moment somebody started doing math they had no real business doing, adding up a column of numbers that weren't actually there in any way that mattered, and deciding, quietly, behind that practiced smile, that he already knew the sum before anyone had given him a single figure to work with. I kept coming back every Sunday after that, same as always. Maya kept pouring that extra cup of tea. Ruth kept being right about things nobody had asked her opinion on, and underneath all of it, so quietly that I mistook it for nothing at all, something was building between Maya and me, that neither of us had found the courage to name. Not the hand on my arm, not the laugh that didn't reach her eyes, not the two chairs angled toward each other on a porch that somebody else had apparently been watching far more closely than either of us realized. Looking back, I think the truest sign was the ordinariness of it. Nothing about those 17 months felt like the beginning of anything while I was living through them. There was no single moment I could point to and say, that was it. That was the turn. It was only ever an accumulation of small things, an extra cup of tea, a hand on my arm, a laugh that didn't quite land stacking up quietly in a place I wasn't ready to look at, the way sawdust collects in the corners of a shop, until one day you realize you can't remember the last time you swept it out. Elena and Derek got engaged fast. Faster than made sense, if I'm being honest, though it wasn't my place to say so out loud to anyone. 18 months after Elena and I split, Ruth got the call, and 2 weeks after that, the whole family gathered for Ruth's 78th birthday, which somehow turned into an engagement celebration as well, since Elena wanted to share her news while everyone was already together in one place. I almost didn't go that night. Something in me hesitated all that week, some quiet instinct I never bothered to examine closely enough at the time. But Ruth had called me herself, the way she always did, and told me not to be foolish, that I was family whether anybody had ever signed papers to make it official or not. So I went, same as I always did, and told myself there was nothing to hesitate about in the first place. The house was full that evening. String lights hung across the porch railing. A cake sat on the counter with too many candles for anyone to count accurately, and Ruth held court from her favorite chair in her good dress, clearly enjoying every minute of the attention. Maya sat beside me at the long table, the same seat she always took, and for a while it felt like any other Sunday, just louder, just fuller, just dressed up a little more than usual. Derek stood up at one point to make a toast, glass raised, voice warm and easy in the way of someone used to being listened to. He talked about how grateful he was to be welcomed into such a close family, and for a moment it sounded like nothing more than the kind of thing people say at engagement parties, harmless and expected. But then his eyes moved down the table, slow and deliberate, and landed on me. "Funny," he said, still smiling, still holding that glass like the words weren't about to land the way they were about to land, how the ex-boyfriend keeps finding reasons to be at every family dinner, almost like he's shopping for the next Whitfield sister. The table went quiet in the particular way. A room goes quiet when everyone understands exactly what was just said, and nobody wants to be the first person to react to it. Somebody's fork stopped halfway to their mouth and just stayed there. I felt Maya go completely still beside me, her hands folded tight in her lap. Elena looked down at her plate and didn't say a single word, not in my defense, not in Maya's, and the silence from her end of the table felt louder than anything Derek had actually said. I understood, even in that exact moment, some of what was happening to Elena. She'd lost her job that spring. She was leaning on Derek in ways she hadn't leaned on anyone in a long time, and I think some part of her had already decided that keeping the peace at her own engagement dinner mattered more tonight than correcting the man she was about to marry. I wasn't angry at her for it, not really, not even then, but I felt the absence of her voice all the same, sitting in that silence like a weight nobody else at the table seemed to notice. "Say that again," I said. Not loud, just steady, the way you talk to something you don't want to spook into doing anything worse. Derek held both hands up, palms out, that same practiced smile still fixed in place, and said something about it being just a joke. "Man, come on, lighten up," and the conversation limped forward from there, everyone working a little too hard to talk about something else, anything else. Ruth cut the cake a few minutes later than planned. Somebody put music on low in the background, but the damage had already been done by then, and I could feel it sitting in the air over that table like smoke that refused to clear, no matter how many windows you opened. Maya didn't say another word for the rest of dinner. She smiled when she needed to smile, answered when somebody asked her something directly, but her eyes had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere none of us were invited to follow. When people started saying their goodbyes, she slipped outside before dessert plates had even been cleared, and I found her a few minutes later standing out by my truck in the dark, arms wrapped tight around herself against the cold. "Don't come for a while," she said, before I could get a single word out. She wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed somewhere out past the tree line. "Please, Nathan, not because of anything you did wrong, because of what it does to her, to all of it. Every single time you're here and he's watching, adding things up in his head that were never true to begin with." "Maya, I mean it." Her voice cracked slightly on that last word, just enough that I heard it, even though I don't think she meant for me to hear it at all. "Just give it some time, please, for Elena's sake, for everyone's sake." I told myself, standing there in that gravel lot with the cold coming up through the soles of my boots, that she meant it exactly the way it sounded. A practical request, born out of one uncomfortable night, nothing more complicated underneath it than that. I nodded, told her I understood, and drove home with the porch lantern shrinking small in my rearview mirror until the road curved and it disappeared behind the trees altogether. I didn't know, standing in that parking lot with the engine idling under me, that I was looking at the last night I would see that porch for 3 months straight, and I definitely didn't know, not yet, that Maya would spend every single one of those 3 months regretting the words she had just said to me more than almost anything else she had ever said in her entire life. I drove the whole way home, telling myself it was fine, that this was temporary, that families sort themselves out, and I had no real business inserting myself into whatever was happening between Elena and the man she was about to marry. I believed most of that for a while, not all of it, but most of it for a while was enough to get me through the drive. The 3 months that followed were quieter than any stretch of time I'd had in years, and not in the good way. I kept myself busy in the shop, took on more work than I needed to, refinished an entire set of church pews somebody had salvaged from a building slated for demolition, anything that would keep my hands moving and my mind from wandering out toward that gravel driveway. Ruth called me twice during those months, and both times I let it go to voicemail, not because I didn't want to hear her voice, but because I was afraid of what I might say if I picked up, afraid I'd ask the one question I had no business asking a 78-year-old woman over the phone. I heard secondhand, through a mutual friend, that Elena and Derek had set a date. I heard nothing at all from Maya, and I told myself that silence was exactly what she'd asked for, and that respecting it was the least I could do for a family that had given me 17 months of Sundays I never had any right to expect in the first place. So there I was again, 3 months later, standing in my own doorway close to midnight, looking at the very person who had asked me to stay away, holding a lantern that hadn't been plugged into anything in weeks, maybe longer. "Is Ruth okay?" I asked, because that was the first fear that surfaced, the practical one, the one that made the most sense given everything that had happened between us since I'd last stood on that porch. "She's fine," Maya said quickly, stepping past me into the front hallway when I moved aside to let her in. "Tired. Missing you. If I'm being honest with you, she asks about you almost every single day, wants to know why you stopped calling. Why the chair across from her at dinner has been sitting empty for 3 months running." She paused, shifted the lantern from one hand to the other, and for a moment she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. That's part of why I came tonight." "Part of why," I repeated, and something in the careful way she'd phrased it made me stay right where I was instead of moving toward the kitchen or the couch, or anywhere that might make this feel like an ordinary visit. Is that the only reason, Maya? She didn't answer right away. I could hear the wind moving through the trees outside, rattling the last of the dead leaves still clinging to the branches, and I watched her jaw tighten in that particular way it always did whenever she was deciding between something true and something safe. I'd seen that look before, across Ruth's dinner table, 100 times, and I'd never once let myself ask what was underneath it. "No," she finally said, so quietly I almost missed it over the sound of the wind. "It's not the only reason." I stood there and let the silence stretch out between us, the dark lantern still hanging from her hand, neither of us moving to set it down or plug it in, like whoever spoke next was going to have to live with whatever came out of their mouth. "Derek was wrong about one thing," she said at last, her eyes finally lifting to meet mine. "I wasn't shopping for anything. I never was. Not for one single second of any of this. I was the one who told you to stay away, Nathan. Not him. Not Elena. Me. And I have hated myself for it every Sunday since." Sitting across from your empty chair at that table, watching Ruth ask when you were finally coming back, and not being able to tell her the truth, because the truth was that I was the reason you weren't there in the first place. "Why?" I asked, though some part of me had already started putting the pieces together, the two chairs angled toward each other, the extra cup of tea, the hand that stayed on my arm half a second longer than it needed to. "Because I was scared," she said, and her voice had gone quieter now, stripped down to something I'd never heard from her before, not even close. Not of Derek. Not really. Not underneath it all. "I was scared of what it would mean if I let you keep coming. If I let myself keep feeling what I was feeling every single Sunday for over a year, and it turned out I was the only one feeling any of it. I thought pushing you away was going to be safer than finding that out for certain. I told myself I was protecting Elena, protecting the family, protecting all of it. But if I'm being honest with you right now, standing in your doorway at midnight, I think I was mostly just protecting myself. I felt something loosen in my chest that had been sitting there, tight and unnamed, for longer than I was willing to admit even to myself. "I noticed you, Maya," I said, "the hand on my arm the night I fixed the lantern wiring, the way your laugh didn't reach your eyes whenever you asked me why I kept coming back. I noticed all of it, every single time. I just didn't let myself say it out loud, because you were Elena's sister, and it felt like a door I didn't have any permission to open, no matter how many Sundays I spent standing right in front of it." "You didn't need permission," she said, and for the first time all night, she looked directly at me instead of at the lantern hanging between us. "You just needed me to stop being a coward about it, which took me a lot longer than it should have." "You're not a coward," I said. "You were protecting people you love, the best way you knew how to do it in that moment. That's not the same thing as cowardice, not to me." She let out a breath that was almost a laugh, almost something else entirely, something closer to relief than anything else. It felt the same. Some nights, most nights, if I'm honest. I reached down and finally took the lantern from her hands, and this time, instead of setting it aside the way we'd both been avoiding doing, I found the outlet by my front door and plugged the cord in myself. It flickered once, then twice, that same stubborn hesitation it always had out on Ruth's porch, before it finally caught and held steady, casting warm amber light across both our faces in that dark hallway. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. We just stood there in that light. 3 months of silence finally sitting between us instead of keeping us apart, and I understood, maybe for the first time all the way through, that some things don't stay broken because nobody wants to fix them. They stay broken because both people involved are quietly waiting for the other one to go first. "I'm sorry it took me this long," she said. "You came," I said. "Tonight, after everything, that's the part that actually matters to me." That was the night everything started over, though neither of us called it that at the time, not out loud. We didn't rush anything. If anything, the weeks that followed were more careful than what came before, both of us a little too aware now of what we might lose if we got it wrong a second time. I started going back to Ruth's on Sundays, and this time Maya rode with me instead of meeting me there separately, the two of us pulling into that gravel driveway together for the first time in nearly 2 years, the lantern already glowing amber above the door before we even got out of the truck. Ruth, of course, saw exactly what was happening long before either of us said a single word about it to her directly. She had a way of looking at people that made you feel like she'd already read the last chapter of your story and was simply waiting, with tremendous patience, for the rest of us to finally catch up to her. "About time," she said the very first Sunday we walked in together, not even looking up from the roast she was pulling out of the oven. I was starting to think I'd have to write it down for the two of you on a napkin and leave it on the table. As for Derek, the months that followed showed him for exactly what he was. Slowly, the way most true things reveal themselves, not in one dramatic collapse across a dinner table, but in 100 small moments that eventually add up to something nobody can keep ignoring. Elena, once she was back on her feet with a new job and a little more room to breathe than she'd had all year, started noticing the same things the rest of us had been quietly noticing for a while by then. The way he needed to be the loudest voice in every room he walked into. The way his kindness always seemed to come with an invoice attached somewhere underneath it, waiting to be collected. Their engagement ended quietly that spring, without any kind of scene, nothing like the one he'd once tried to create at Ruth's table. Elena didn't say much about it to anyone, but the first thing she did afterward was call Maya, and the two of them talked for almost 2 hours straight. I didn't ask what was said between them. Some conversations belong entirely to the people having them, and I've always believed that. Maya and I took our time with each other. We didn't announce anything to anyone, not at first, not for a while. We just kept showing up, kept sitting in those same 2 rocking chairs on the porch, kept letting the lantern burn late into the night while we talked about nothing that mattered and everything that did, the same as we always had, except now neither one of us reached for a reason to leave before we had to. Winter passed the way winter always does in the mountains. Slow at first, and then all at once. Spring came in gradually after that. Wisteria climbing up the fence line at Ruth's house one week and suddenly everywhere the next, like it had been waiting for permission the whole time. I fixed the porch railing properly. Finally, the same one Maya had once grabbed my arm to save from wet paint 2 years earlier. I rehung the lantern myself, replaced the wiring so it wouldn't flicker anymore the way it always used to, though some stubborn part of me left it just slightly imperfect on purpose because I'd grown fond of the way it hesitated before it caught, like it was deciding, every single time, whether it was finally ready to commit to staying lit for good. A year passed before either of us said the actual word out loud, and even then, it wasn't some big declaration with any kind of ceremony attached to it. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening in my shop, sawdust hanging in the air, Maya sitting on an old stool, watching me sand down a table leg, the way she'd watched me do 100 small tasks by then, and she said, without any particular build-up, "I love you, you know," the same way you'd mention the weather changing, the same steady voice she used for absolutely everything that actually mattered to her. "I know," I said, setting the sandpaper down. "I love you too." Took me long enough to say it out loud. Took us both long enough, she said, and that was that. No fireworks. No speech prepared in advance, just 2 people who had finally stopped being so careful with something that had never really needed careful handling in the first place. Not once, not from the very beginning. By the time Ruth's next birthday rolled around, we were engaged, and we told her ourselves, at her table, in the same seats we'd always taken, on the same porch where everything had once nearly fallen apart in front of everyone we loved. Ruth turned 79 that year. Same porch, same long table, same string lights strung a little crookedly across the railing because Ruth insisted on hanging them herself and refused every single offer of help from anyone in the family. This time, when everyone gathered together, there was no toast that quietly turned into an accusation, no smile hiding something sharp underneath it, waiting to land on somebody at the table. Elena was there, and when Maya and I made our announcement, she was the very first person out of her chair, wrapping her arms around both of us at once, laughing in a way I honestly hadn't heard from her in years, maybe not since before any of this began. "Took you too long enough," Ruth said from her rocking chair, not even trying to hide her smile this time. "We were being careful," Maya said, smiling back at her. "Careful," Ruth said, "is just another word for scared. I'm glad the 2 of you finally got over it, whatever it was." Later that night, after the cake had been cut and the guests had thinned out, and Ruth had gone up to bed with her usual complaint about her knees, Maya and I ended up back in those 2 rocking chairs, angled toward each other the way they always had been, whether anyone was sitting in them or not, whether anyone was watching or not. A spring wind moved through the yard, and the lantern flickered once above us, that same old hesitation it always had, before it caught and held steady in the dark. Neither of us moved to fix it this time. We just sat there together and waited for the light to settle on its own, because some things, I'd finally learned after all of it, don't need fixing. They just need somebody willing to wait for the current to find its way. Looking back on all of it now, I understand something I couldn't have understood standing in that doorway at midnight. 3 months into a silence I honestly believed was permanent. That lantern had never really gone dark, not in any way that mattered. It had just been sitting there, unplugged, waiting for somebody brave enough to reach for the outlet and finally commit to the light staying on. She was just the one who'd been afraid, for a while, to plug it back in. Have you ever pushed someone away because you genuinely believed you were protecting them, only to realize much later how close it came to costing you everything you actually wanted? And if that person showed up at your door tonight, out of nowhere, lantern in hand, no warning, nothing but a single sentence to explain themselves, would you finally let the light stay on? Or would you let the moment pass you by the same way it almost passed us by? I think about that midnight more than I think about almost anything else from those 2 years. Not the engagement party, not the 3 months of silence, not even the argument that started all of it. Just her, standing on my porch, holding something that hadn't been plugged in for a long time, waiting to see if I'd let her in. If this story found its way to you tonight, I hope it meant something to you the way it still means something to me. Hit like if you felt any part of this. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and tell me down in the comments who was your porch light, the person you almost let go dark before you finally found the courage to plug it back in and let it stay that way.